Hi there, this is Brittany from By Brittany Goldwyn. I post videos about plants and projects, and today we are going to be talking about the easiest ways to propagate houseplants. So there are obviously lots of different houseplants that you may want to propagate, and that means that there are lots of different tips and tricks and things you may need to remember while propagating each of your houseplants. So for today's video, we are going to be focusing on some of the most common houseplants you may be interested in propagating and walking through the steps to propagate those. First, we'll talk about how to take a good cutting and some things to remember when you're taking cuttings of your houseplants, and then we'll talk about some of the different ways you can root those cuttings to grow new plants. First, we're going to talk about where to take a cutting on a pothos plant. So this is a cebu blue pothos plant. I trim this one regularly just to encourage fullness and bushiness in the plant, and because when you grow cebu blue as a trailing plant, the leaves can sometimes get a little smaller, so I like to trim those off and propagate them. Now, the first thing you need to do is grab any stem on the plant, pull it up, and look at these spots here. So these are growth points where a leaf will emerge from the stem. Now, in order to root a pothos cutting, you need to have a growth point. So for example, you couldn't cut right here and then root just this leaf to grow a new plant. You would need to cut right here to root the plant. I'll show you a few other examples on some other stems. Here's another example of a great place to cut on this plant. So for this one, I would probably cut right here, because this growth point actually does not have a leaf, and that can lead to leggier growth. So if I take the cutting right here, I could ensure that I have a growth point right here, and then I have 2 leaves on top of the cutting. So I like to shoot for between 1 to 3 leaves or sets of leaves depending on the plant, just because you don't want to have cuttings that are too long to root, because then the cutting will put all of its energy into keeping those leaves, the foliage, alive instead of growing new roots. Now you may be wondering what happens after I cut a plant. It will keep growing, don't worry. As I've said, I've cut this specific cebu blue pothos many times to keep it growing nice and bushy. This is an example of exactly what will happen. So when you look at this stem, you can see this is where I previously cut and took a cutting from this one. What the plant then does is sprouts new growth from the closest growth point. So you'll see that it already had a leaf growing here, but it sprouted new growth coming out of there, and now that growth is its own little stem with leaves growing from it. So since it sprouts new growth kind of off to the side a little bit, that's one of the reasons that I encourage regular pruning, especially of your trailing plants, if you want that big, bushy, full look. So while I'm down here talking about the cebu blue, I'm going to go ahead and take a couple cuttings to propagate of this one. Now, this one is always a plant that goes relatively quickly when I post it for like plant swaps or giveaways, or if I'm selling cuttings for super cheap in my local Facebook plant group. So I definitely want to take a lot of cuttings of this for the Master Gardener plant sale that I'm taking cuttings for today. Now, the Master Gardener group that I'm training with has a plant sale every spring, like a lot of Master Gardener groups, to raise money for the organization. And a lot of the plants are actually donated from the Master Gardeners or Master Gardener interns to help generate revenue that the program can spend. So I'm looking at some of my more popular plants that I know people generally like to buy when I do like plant giveaways of all the cuttings I've taken. And cebu blue is one of those plants. So I'm just gonna right now I'm looking for areas like this right here that have growth points that don't have any leaves. Those are really great areas to take to propagate, because you don't have to remove any of the bottommost sets of leaves because it already has a growth point with no leaves on it. And now we're going to do the same thing on this Marble Queen pothos. As you can see, this one is super long. I usually have this one in my kitchen on top of my kitchen cabinets. And then these super long stems I have vining along the walls using command hooks. But I'm going to give this one a little trim because it is starting to look just a bit scraggly on the ends. Now I'm going to take the same steps here, looking along the ends of the stems to see where I can cut to help improve the growth on this plant. So when I look at this one, I can see there is this leaf here that's kind of keeled off and died. So what I'm going to do is choose that as my cut point, because I don't see anywhere else along here that looks super sparse or leggy. So I am going to come and cut right here. What that does is it exposes this growth point, so I know I won't have to remove any leaves from this cutting. Now, another common houseplant that you probably have that you may want to take cuttings of to propagate is a monstera deliciosa. The process is very similar to taking a cutting for a pothos. You can't just take a leaf cutting, you need a growth point from the stem. And I don't have any monsteras right now that I want to take cuttings from, but I will show you where on the plant to cut, and then I will throw up some pictures of exactly what I mean by taking a smaller cutting of a monstera. Okay, we're taking a look at my small monstera constellation as an example. And you can see here on the stem that the leaves on this one grow in kind of an alternating pattern around the stem, up the stem. So essentially, if you wanted to propagate this plant, you can see this is the newest leaf here that's come out. This is the second oldest leaf. So if I wanted to propagate this plant, what I would probably do is take a cutting right here. And then I would remove this third oldest leaf and root the top two cuttings. Now, this plant is getting a little bit large for me to cut and propagate because, again, the larger the leaves, the harder it is for the plant to grow a new root system while also maintaining the leaves that it has. But that is the same philosophy of where to cut the plant no matter what size it is. And I have propagated many monstera deliciosas, but my big one is just way too big to cut and propagate at this point. But again, it's the same philosophy of where to cut. So look toward the end of a stem. I can see that this is the very end of the stem. So what I would probably do with this one is cut right here, then remove this second oldest leaf so that I had a leaf with a growth point on the end. And I will throw up a couple of pictures of what this looks like on a smaller monstera, because again, if you get a smaller monstera, it's much, much easier to take those cuttings and root them. And while it's not a deliciosa, the monstera dubia also has a similar process for taking a cutting that I will illustrate because I am going to be taking some cuttings of this one to root for the plant sale. This is an excellent area to take a cutting from. This one is just starting to wrap around the board, but I can see that this growth point here does not have a leaf growing from it, so it is a bit leggy. What I will do is cut right here and then root that cutting. And last but not least, I'll cover taking cuttings from a Hoya carnosa. There are lots of different varieties of Hoya carnosa, but the reason I want to cover this is because it's a little bit different from the steps I outlined to take cuttings from a pothos or a monstera. So this one, Hoya carnosas in particular, are unique because they can root anywhere along the stem. So you do not need to get a growth point like right here where the leaves grow from the stem to root a Hoya cutting. You could take the cutting right here and root these top two leaves, which is exactly what I'm about to do because this guy is getting a little bit unruly. This is also my Hoya carnosa crimson princess, which is a variegated plant. And as you can see, these leaves are not variegated. So a really good best practice is to, if you have a variegated plant and the leaves start to revert their variegation to a solid colored leaf, to trim it off and hope for the best with the new growth. Now you may be wondering, I keep saying you don't want your cuttings to be too big when you are rooting them for propagation. So what do I do with all of these longer cuttings that I took from my plants? We're gonna cut them up some more. So what I'm gonna do is take the end here. This is the growth point. So this is sometimes referred to as a top cut. If you're looking for a cutting in a plant group or something, this is a top cut. So this one has a couple good leaves here. So what I'm going to do is take the cutting right here. So that leaves me with 4 leaves. I'm not counting this one, little one that is emerging right now. I am going to remove the bottommost leaf to expose that growth point, and then I am going to run with this propagation. Because when I cut propagations, I like to pot them up so that there's like a little bit of height difference in the plant so that it looks a little bit more mature and not like a bunch of random cuttings potted together in a pot, which is what it is, but we like to try and make it look better if we can. Okay, so just from that one strand, I've taken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different cuttings. And one of them is a top cut that is a little bit bigger than the other one. So you can see this will look really nice once I've rooted these all and I pot them up together in a pot. It will look more like a plant and less like a bunch of jumbled cuttings together. Now with the Hoyas, you'll remember the carnosas can root anywhere along the stem, so you don't have to be as precise when taking these cuttings to root. You just need to make sure you have 1 to 3 leaves, I would recommend, and at least a bit of the stem. If you can get an exposed growth point, that's fine too. Okay, so from that one long stem, we've got this nice little cluster of cuttings that will make a lovely plant in one pot once they are rooted and ready to grow. And if you're interested in more about Hoya carnosa propagation, I love propagating Hoyas. I have a video completely dedicated to Hoya carnosa propagation, so check that out for more. Now we've got all these cuttings ready to go, so how do you root them? First, we're going to talk about water rooting. Now I do recommend something like a clear container first for water rooting because you can monitor the root development. And this is a good example of a bunch of those cuttings we just took, added into a little water jar, just kind of like a bouquet of flowers. And that's another reason why I love water propagation so much, because you could just take all of these cuttings and pop them in water and put them around your house while they are rooting, and it's kind of like having a cut flower bouquet. Now, before we get too much into water rooting, I want to talk a little bit about water rooting versus soil rooting. So you may be wondering, if overwatering houseplants is such a big killer of houseplants, how can I root cuttings or even grow plants exclusively in water, as you do with hydroponics, if overwatering also kills them? So this is something that stumped me for a long time, but it's really a simple answer, and that is that the plant grows different types of roots based on what you're growing it in. So it's basically just the plant's way of adapting to the environment you have it in. Now, this cutting is an example of some really, really good water roots. So these are, you can see they're very fine, they're almost kind of translucent in parts, or they're very white, they're very thin, they're a bit slimy because they're grown in water. And essentially what these roots do is they take in less water because they don't want to flood the plant. Now, if you were to dig up a plant that you had rooted in soil, or just any of your plants really that you have growing in soil, you would see that the roots are thicker, they're more fibrous, and that is so that they can take in a little bit more water. They have little root hairs all over them, so that they aren't drowning the plant. It's basically like they are adapting to what environment they are in. Now, that means that if you're rooting plants in water, those water roots aren't necessarily going to be suitable for soil. So a lot of people argue, if you root a plant in water and transition it to soil, it will go through a lot of transplant shock. And that is true in a lot of cases. But I generally find that with easier houseplants and plants that are easier to propagate, like the ones we're covering today, so pothos varieties, many varieties of monstera, and a lot of Hoya carnosa, specifically Hoya carnosa compacta, Hoya carnosa crimson queen, those types of easy common Hoyas, they generally do a little bit better when you transition the water-rooted cuttings into soil. You just want to make sure that you keep the soil evenly moist for a couple of weeks, a little bit more water than you generally give the plant if it were an established plant, to help those roots convert to soil roots. And don't be surprised if there's a little bit of a shock, maybe like some drooping, a yellowing leaf or two, when you transplant your propagated cuttings to soil. Now, a lot of these cuttings here I've had in here for a couple of weeks, and I am about ready to transplant these to soil. So here are some examples of 2 Hoya cuttings. I generally just let the water roots get a couple inches long, and then I pop them into soil. It's really not a science for me, because a lot of times I'm taking cuttings and popping them in water just because I don't feel like potting them up that day. So I just sit this on a table and let it look pretty until I am ready to propagate them. It's the exact same process for the other plants we covered in this video. So this is a bunch of the pothos cuttings I took. I just took all of these cuttings and popped them into the jar. You can see all of those growth points in the bottom of the jar. So now all I am going to do is add a little bit of room temperature water. I just use tap water for my propagations. And then I set it in a nice bright spot and I wait. I monitor the roots to make sure that there's no like major signs of rot or anything. And I tend to want to dump out the water and refresh it every like week or so. You will deal with some water evaporation with your plants, especially if it's very dry inside of your house, as it is with mine right now in the middle of winter. So you want to monitor those water levels to make sure that all of those growth points are still submerged in the water. Now, I'm sure you've seen some of these test tube propagation setups. This is one that I made myself, but you can get them everywhere. They are really nice because if you have longer cuttings, you can stick them down into the test tube. And again, it just looks really pretty sitting on a shelf or something. So I will load up as many cuttings as I can in each of these test tubes, and then I will fill them with water and set them out. And when I'm using the test tubes, I like to use the cuttings that have a longer stem instead of these tiny ones that just have one leaf and then a growth point on the end. Those I really like using in the smaller jar that I showed earlier, or something like the cluster bud vase, because they have less of an area to put water in, so they generally just fit a little bit better in there. Now, regardless of whether or not you are transitioning a water-rooted cutting to soil, as with this one, or a fresh cutting to soil, as with this obovata cutting that is not rooted but has tons of these little aerial root sprouts on its stem, the process is going to be the same. Just fill a little pot with drainage holes on the bottom with some fresh potting soil. And this one I'm actually going to add a bit more soil and then poke a hole down in the middle because I'm just going to be planting one obovata cutting in this. So I'm going to use my finger because I am always covered in dirt and I never wear gloves. They just slow me down sometimes. Stick this guy all the way down in there and then tighten up that soil around it. Now, as a reminder, this Hoya cutting will root anywhere on the stem, so it's not really that big of a deal to make sure I'm getting a growth point down in soil or anything like with some other cuttings. And since this is a fresh cutting that I've taken, I'm going to make sure I keep this cutting super moist. I want to keep this soil evenly moist and keep this in a warm, and if I can swing it, humid environment, but it's the middle of winter here in Zone 7A, so quite dry in my house. And we'll water this once I clean everything up in the sink. Right now I've just got a little bag down to prevent too much soil from going down the drain. So just like that, it's all potted up, ready for a deep, thorough watering. And then we'll do the same thing with a bunch of the Hoya cuttings that have been rooting in water. And again, you may be asking yourself, well, why even root in water if you can just plant directly in soil? And the answer to that is, I don't know, I just like rooting in water. I really do. I like taking cuttings and watching them root. I think the process of watching the roots grow is really interesting and fun. And I just really enjoy having those cuttings around the house. So if it's not something you're into, feel free to skip directly to soil rooting. It's really not a huge deal. You just gotta have fun with it and not overthink too much when it comes to plants. So these are not carnosa cuttings. This is actually Hoya australis cuttings. Australis? Not sure. But they root pretty much the same as Hoya carnosa. So I chopped up one of my plants and I am going to be taking some of these to the Master Gardener plant sale and starting over with one of them for myself because my plant was getting quite leggy. So I decided, let's chop her up and start from the beginning. So I'll pick my favorite and keep it for myself. All right, everyone, that wraps up my thoughts on the easiest way to propagate some of the most common houseplants. I hope you all found this useful and that you use it to grow more plants to share with the people around you. Until next time, happy planting.